Welcome to the Mr. History Podcast. Today, we're diving into a system that sparked more than its fair share of debate, the U.S. Electoral College.
Yeah,
You know, the one that determines who sits in the Oval Office.
right,
We're going to unpack how it works,
right.
why it was created, and whether it still makes sense in the 21st century.
It's a system that on the surface seems pretty straightforward. Electors from each state vote for the president, not the popular vote. Each state gets electors based on its representation in Congress. Senators plus representatives.
Okay.
There are 538 in total, and a candidate needs a majority 270 to win.
But as I'm sure you know, it's rarely that simple.
Right.
We've seen instances where the person who wins the popular vote doesn't actually become president.
Exactly. And to understand why that happens, we need to go back to the framers of the Constitution.
Right.
Remember, they didn't exactly have Twitter or 24-hour news cycles back in 1787.
So no attack ads on Facebook. Hard to imagine.
That's precisely. Their world was vastly different. They were worried about factions, as James Madison called them in Federalist Number 10, gaining too much power. Think of it like interest groups, but with powdered wigs and tricorn hats.
Got it. They wanted to avoid any one group dominating the election. Did they see the Electoral College as a way to ensure a broader consensus?
Yes, and to prevent what they called tumult and disorder. They wanted a system that encouraged deliberation and spread the decision-making process across different locations. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Number 68 argued it would lead to peaceful transitions of power, which was a huge concern after the chaotic years following the revolution.
Okay, so it was about balance and stability.
Yeah.
But how did it actually work back then? I mean, did people even vote directly for president?
Initially, state legislatures chose the electors. Imagine that a group of politicians in a back room deciding who gets to be president.
Wow.
It wasn't until later, by 1864, that most states switched to popular elections to choose their electors.
Wow. That's a pretty big shift. So how did we get from that system to the winner-take-all approach we have in most states today?
The rise of political parties played a significant role. As these parties gained influence, states started adopting the winner-take-all system, where all of a state's electors go to the candidate who wins the state's popular vote. It's a simple, but not always fair, way to divvy up the electoral votes.
And that's where the whole popular vote versus electoral vote issue comes in, right?
Exactly, because electoral votes aren't perfectly proportional to population. You can have a candidate win the popular vote nationwide, but lose the election if they don't win the right combination of states. Think about it, a candidate could win California by a landslide and rack up a huge popular vote lead, but if they lose a bunch of smaller states by narrow margins, they could still lose the Electoral College. It's happened 5 times in U.S. history.
That seems incredibly counterintuitive. I mean, shouldn't the person with the most votes win? No wonder it's such a controversial system.
Absolutely, and that brings us to a pivotal question. Has the Electoral College outlived its usefulness? It was designed for a world vastly different from our own. Today, we have instant communication and nationwide campaigns. Does a system created to prevent 18th century factions still make sense in the age of social media and hyper-partisanship?
Now, that's a question worth pondering. And I'm sure our listeners are already forming their own opinions.
It's not an easy answer, and that's what makes this topic so fascinating. The debate is ongoing, and there have been various attempts to reform or even abolish the Electoral College throughout history.
Speaking of reform, let's dive into some of the proposed alternatives. I know you mentioned that some states do things a little differently. Can you tell us more about that?
You're right, not all states follow the winner-take-all approach. Maine and Nebraska use what's called the district method.
Okay.
They split their electoral votes based on which candidate wins each congressional district. So it's not just a statewide sweep for the winner.
So it's a little more nuanced
Yeah.
and potentially more representative of the voters' preferences within the state. But does that really solve the bigger issue of the popular vote potentially losing out?
It's a step towards proportionality, but it's not a cure-all. You could still have a scenario where the winner of the national popular vote loses the presidency.
Right.
It's an interesting approach, but it doesn't address all the concerns surrounding the Electoral College.
So have there been any more drastic attempts to change the system, like efforts to completely abolish the Electoral College?
There have been, and some came surprisingly close to succeeding.
Really?
The most notable was the Bayh-Celler Amendment, proposed in the late 1960s. It actually passed the House of Representatives with a huge majority, but was ultimately blocked in the Senate.
Wow. I'm surprised I never heard of that. What happened? Why didn't it pass?
Politics, my friend, politics. There was a lot of opposition from smaller states. They worried that a national popular vote system would diminish their influence and lead to candidates focusing solely on high population areas. It's a valid concern, and it highlights the tension between federalism and national unity that's woven into the fabric of American democracy.
It seems like every solution has its own set of challenges and trade-offs. Are there any reform efforts gaining traction today?
There is one that's particularly interesting, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
Hmm.
It's an agreement between states that says they'll award all their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, regardless of who wins in their individual state.
Just like a workaround, right? They're not actually changing the Constitution,
Yeah,
but they're changing how the Electoral College operates in practice.
exactly. It's a clever approach that sidesteps the tricky process of amending the Constitution. The idea is that if enough states join the compact, representing a majority of electoral votes, then the winner of the national popular vote would automatically become president, even if they lose some individual states.
It sounds like a potential game changer. How many states have signed on so far?
It's gained significant traction in recent years. 17 states and the District of Columbia are already on board, representing 195 electoral votes.
That's impressive. So they're more than halfway to that magic number of 270. But I imagine there's plenty of opposition to this compact as well, right?
Of course. Critics argue that it undermines the principle of federalism and could lead to candidates ignoring the concerns of less populated states. They say it would incentivize candidates to focus on big cities and media hubs, potentially overlooking the needs of rural communities.
It's a classic debate. National unity versus state power. How do you balance the need for a fair and representative system with the concerns of individual states? It's a tough question with no easy answers. But I think it's important to remember that the Electoral College isn't just some abstract concept. It has real-world consequences for how campaigns are run and how our leaders are chosen.
Absolutely. It shapes everything from campaign strategies to voter turnout. Think about it, if you live in a state that's considered solidly red or blue, you might feel like your vote doesn't really matter in a presidential election.
Yeah.
Candidates tend to focus their resources on those crucial swing states, where the outcome is less predictable.
The states that are always in the headlines during election season. And I guess that makes sense from a strategic standpoint. But it does seem to create a system where certain voters have more influence than others.
It's a valid criticism, and it highlights how the Electoral College can distort the democratic process, potentially leading to a disconnect between the will of the people and the outcome of the election.
It's fascinating how a system designed to prevent chaos and instability might be contributing to those very things in a different way.
It's a paradox for sure, and it's one that continues to spark debate and discussion. There's no easy fix, no perfect solution, but I think it's important for people to understand how the system works and to engage in thoughtful conversations about its implications for American democracy.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on the Electoral College, and I hope our listeners are feeling the same way. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more intriguing aspect of this system: the faithless electors. What exactly are they, and why do they sometimes make headlines?
Ah, yes, the faithless electors. They're those rare but fascinating instances where an elector chooses to vote differently than they're pledged. You see, most states have laws binding electors to vote for the candidate who won their state, but it's not always enforced.
Wait, so an elector could go rogue and vote for someone else? That seems like it could really shake things up, especially in a close election.
It certainly has the potential to, though it's never actually changed the outcome of a presidential election. But the very possibility adds another layer of complexity to this already intricate system.
I can imagine. Has the Supreme Court weighed in on this at all? It seems like something that would end up in front of them eventually.
They have indeed. In a 2020 case, Chafalo v. Washington, the Supreme Court ruled that states can punish faithless electors. So while it's still technically possible, the legal consequences make it far less likely to happen.
So they can't just go rogue without facing repercussions. That makes sense. But even if it's rare, it does raise questions about the integrity of the system. If electors aren't bound to follow the will of the voters, what's to stop them from making decisions based on personal preference or even outside influence?
That's a valid concern, and it's one that fuels the debate over whether the Electoral College is truly a democratic system. Critics argue that it creates too much room for uncertainty and potential manipulation. Proponents, on the other hand, say that faithless electors are outliers, and that the system has generally worked as intended, ensuring stability and preventing drastic swings in power.
It seems like every aspect of the Electoral College is steeped in history, legal precedent, and political wrangling. This deep dive has been incredibly enlightening, but it's also left me with a lot to ponder. What does the future hold for the Electoral College? Is it destined to remain a source of controversy and debate?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The system is clearly imperfect and it's faced challenges throughout its history, but it's also remarkably resilient. Despite numerous attempts at reform, it's managed to endure for over 2 centuries.
It's hard to imagine it changing anytime soon, especially given the deep partisan divisions in our country. But who knows? Maybe the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact will eventually gain enough momentum to shift the balance of power. Or perhaps some unforeseen event will trigger a renewed push for reform.
The one thing we can say for certain is that the Electoral College will continue to be a topic of discussion and debate. It's a system that forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about democracy, representation, and the balance of power in our government. And those are conversations worth having, even if they're complex and sometimes contentious.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been a fascinating exploration of one of the most unique and often misunderstood aspects of American democracy. It's certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
As with any historical topic, there's always more to learn and explore. We encourage you to delve deeper into the intricacies of the Electoral College, to examine the arguments for and against reform, and to form your own conclusions about its place in our democracy.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Electoral College, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Mr. History Podcast for more fascinating explorations of the past. We're always uncovering new stories and insights, and we love sharing them with you. Thanks for listening.